Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Cook. I'm a contributing editor here at Tortoise, and welcome to our Education Summit. Thanks in particular today I have to go to Big Change, to Capita, to the Nuffield Foundation and to Santander, who are our partners in putting all of this together. You'll be hearing from some of them later on today. The aim of Tortoise's thinkings are that in principle, one of the problems with journalism that we seek to sort of deal with is the fact that journalists know an awful lot about things like page layout and typefaces, and we don't know enough about the real world. So we have these meetings every morning where we discuss what we know, what we don't know, and what we need to find out. But there are too few people in the room when we have those conversations who really understand the issues at hand. We are not going to have that problem today. We have a really phenomenal program starting now with our keynote with Tom Fletcher, the principal at Hertford College. One of the principles of a think-in is the idea that it's not supposed to be question time. We're not here to quiz people. We're here to work out what people think and to collect contributions. The idea is we find out where we disagree and where we don't, where we do, what we know and what we don't know. We're not really here to, partly, we can quiz Tom Fletcher on his musical past, for example, but it's mostly supposed to be about contributing. So we have an informal rule, which is we don't really allow questions. We do if you push it, but we don't allow questions. I'd also point out that on the side of your screen, you can open up the chat box, and my colleague, Mark St. Andrews, is in there at the moment. We've also got, if you look, a raise hand button. If there's something you'd like to say on the screen, we will, you can volunteer to be called upon. If you say something interesting in the chat as well, I reserve the right to try and get my colleagues to cajole you to speak on camera as well. But we're starting today with Tom Fletcher. So Tom is currently the head of house at Hertford College in Oxford. If you are familiar with Oxford or not, you have seen pictures of it. It's the one with the pretty bridge. But Tom is also I think it's fair to say, best known as a diplomat and someone who's sort of an insider outsider when it comes to education, both obviously completely immersed in it today, but someone who's not a lifer in the sector. And one of the reasons I'm really keen to talk to Tom is that the purpose of this conversation, the whole of today, is really that we've had this remarkable disruption to the education system over the last year. We're going to have to rebuild a lot, and we're going to have to work out what's worth saving and what's not. And actually, it's quite a good moment to talk about what matters in education. That's something that Tom has been thinking deeply about and talking about. And I'm really keen to start there. So Tom, I guess that's a place to start, right? So what, as a diplomat, as an education leader now, what should we be worrying about in education?
Well, thanks, Chris, and it's really great to have the chance to join this conversation. And I'm coming into it conscious that, yeah, I'm a recovering ambassador. I'm from a very different field. Before that, though, I was a teacher, not a great teacher, and of course, like many of us who care about education, I'm a parent, and so I do agonize, like any parent. What is our role as a good ancestor? What are the lessons that we need to pass on to our kids? What are the most important things we've learned from our ancestors that we pass on to our descendants? In a way, there's no more important role. And I suppose more recently, the last year, I've been running an Oxford College, Hertford College, and thinking about how do we develop not just brilliant anthropologists or brilliant classicists or brilliant physicists. And you may hear outside in the street at some point the physicists celebrating the end of their finals, but how do we develop great citizens? How do we develop young people who have that balance between head, hand, and heart, or as we're going to call it here, head, hand, and Hertford? How can we develop those skills in them? And a lot of that, though, does go back to diplomacy. So I was in Lebanon for 4 years, and on my watch, we were overseeing for much of that time, the embassy in Damascus. That civil war was going on just up the road. I lived literally on the road to Damascus. And so I suppose my revelation was that whoever you blame for the Syrian war and all of those who have been killed or displaced by that conflict, we shouldn't make the million Syrian kids out of school pay for that. And so I got into, as I left diplomacy, I got into trying to work to get those million kids back into school in Jordan, in Lebanon, and Turkey, and elsewhere. And through that process, I realized something even more challenging, which was that even when you get kids into school, there's a real risk at the moment that most kids are learning the wrong things in the wrong ways. And that unless we find better ways to pass on these lessons about how we live together. You know, I wrote in the book about diplomacy that the big dividing line is between, in the 21st century, is between people who want to build a bigger wall and think that's the answer to the 21st century, and the coexisters. And diplomats, in a way, have always been the coexisters. How do we find ways to live together? That Darwinian instinct, which is even more powerful than the desire to fight for resource. Now, I think that starts with education. I think you've got to go right back to basics, to the fundamentals of education, and think about how we develop those people with those skills to live together. If we do that well, we'll have less need of diplomats, less need for people to come along and try to fix those conflicts. So I guess it's a circular way of saying that education to me now is upstream diplomacy.
So do you think, I mean, I guess to be a cynic, right? Is this helpful way of thinking about it for Britain though? So we've got, I mean, I guess Northern Ireland aside, people will say, well, hang on a minute. We don't have anything that's extreme as what you're talking about. And does that sort of lesson apply within states like the UK?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it does partly because of the kinds of crises that are ahead of us. And anyone who complacently feels that the last 5 years are behind us, and that this sort of sense of fragility and instability that we're experiencing are behind us is in for a real shock, because this is now the new normal. And I'm saying that coming from this world of maps and chaps and kind of flags and diplomacy and protocol, we don't have the answers to so many of these crises facing this next generation. And some of those crises will be because the amount of people who will be on the move, as the Sahara gets bigger, as we flee the consequences of climate change, some of those crises will be about trying to find new ways of living together as new communities start to interact. And some of it will be because these friction lines will be within our own societies as well. When I think about those looking to build walls, I'm thinking about one particular American president, thankfully behind us now, not just extremists in the Middle East. So I think one thing we've seen is much more of the rhetoric that I was used to seeing, when I spent way too much time looking at the way that young people were radicalized in the Middle East, much too much time on the internet, seeing the language that people use to divide communities in the Middle East. Exactly the same language that we see in our own debates in the UK and in the US, this sense that we were stronger when we were living apart. And the people over there are dangerous. They think differently to us. They look different to us. And this is a really dangerous polarization in our societies. And again, the source, the way to deal with that is to go back to education. And too much of our education at the moment does divide us. We learn a history about the wars that we happen to win rather than how we learn how to live together between those wars.
Do you think, I guess a cynic, so let me play devil's advocate here, that would it be fair to say you think that effectively education is a vehicle for liberalism then, in a small L sense of the word?
So I think, if you go back to that sort of core purpose of education, I do think that part of the purpose is how do humans learn to live together? And actually that does lead us in that direction. But also part of the core purpose is how do we develop ingenious future humans who will then solve many of these problems that we've left them with. For me, we went away and spent 2 years studying the future of learning. What do we pass on to the next generation? And we looked at this balance between head, hand and heart, knowledge, skills, and sort of values and character. But for the head bit, we weren't saying that just because of Wikipedia, we should just throw out all knowledge now. You don't need to memorize anything. Although we may come on to all the flaws in our current teaching and assessment systems for knowledge. But we thought for the head, 3 big things. One, this idea of how we've learned to live together. Secondly, this idea of the history of ingenuity and creativity. How do we learn to solve these problems in the past? And how do we find the young people, the future humans who will solve these problems that we've left them? And the third big one, of course, was how do we manage our relationship with the planet itself? And in a way, any education system, any curriculum that ignores those 3 things, I think will actually develop former empires, countries that will become the refugees of the future.
Let's move on to that thought you had about what we teach and how. So what do you think what do you think we're teaching now that we shouldn't? What do you think we're not teaching now that we should? Before is a starting, I guess.
So I think if you go on from that head bit I described to the hand and the heart, the things I think we really should be focused on, the skills, the hand bit of this, we've got to teach young people how to learn so that they're not just learning to memorize things, learning facts. You know, many of our exams now effectively tell young people not to work together, not to collaborate, not to use the internet. Whereas actually, as soon as they leave school, those sorts of skills are enormously important. I think as well, we have to teach young people, you know, practically to be what's called globally competent. There's great work the OECD are doing about developing these social emotional skills. How do we develop kids who have critical thinking, who have antennae to adjust, who can see other people's perspectives? Lots of people call these 21st century skills. You know, for me, that's diplomacy. Those are diplomatic skills. So I think those two things are really important. I think the other big aspect of skills is around managing ourselves, our mental health, our physical health, and often that doesn't come through our education systems. And then you've got the values bit of it, the heart bit of it. And for me, that goes right back to what, you know, my parents taught me as a kid. Be kind, be curious, be brave. How do we develop future humans who are kind enough to see this inequality around us and respond to it, curious enough to be coming up with the solutions to the crises ahead of us, but also brave, because this is going to take courage. If this is the new normal, we'll need people who are much more resilient and able to adjust to that new normal.
So I'm gonna by playing devil's advocate, I'm gonna feel like I'm gonna sound like Mr. Gradgrind here, but I think a traditionalist would argue back with you, yes, we need to teach young people skills, but actually the only way we can really do that is by teaching them a corpus of knowledge that they can feed off, and you sort of can't really do one without the other. Do you think that's a fair critique of?
So I do think there's a lot, and I think there is a basic core of knowledge, which does need to be transmitted in that way. But somehow, you know, a lot of this is about the how we learn. Does that really need to be in a factory setting? Does it need to be top down? Do we need to have lecture theatres in which lecturers do what they've done for hundreds of years and effectively read out the book? I think, so I was very struck. I went to California to look at how the kids of the Silicon Valley folk, of big tech, are educating themselves, how those young people are being developed. And it's very striking that there's much more emphasis on creativity, on collaboration, on teamwork, much less emphasis on memorizing things. They're being taught the skills that will set them apart from the machines. So their kids, you know, won't work for the robots will work for them. What I fear in all this is that we're in this sort of sliding doors moment, and where you've got some of the new elite teaching their kids in that way, social emotional skills that I've described, and then the rest of us still teaching our young people skills which will be automated within 20 years, which will mean that our kids will either work for the robots or work for their kids.
I'm going to say something I thought I would never say, but if I were to channel Michael Gove at this point, you know, a sort of super traditionalist, that one of the arguments that he and other people in his sort of headspace on this stuff would argue is, when I go to a dinner party and I make a reference to, you know, Topdown the spot or whatever, and the person who doesn't know that's a reference to Macbeth, you know, loses out, and you need a sort of core of cultural literacy. Otherwise, people who don't have it will be excluded, and we'll always have a sort of elite education system, which will always look like Eton in the early 20th century, and everyone who's not echoing that will basically lose out. Is that fair? You see what I mean? There's a sort of cultural literacy issue there.
I hear you, and I'm not suggesting for a second chucking out Macbeth, but I think what you'd find is actually if you went to Eton now, and it's interesting some of the work that Eton did in putting their curriculum online during the pandemic, actually those schools are realizing the need to teach many more social emotional skills of the type I've described. So they're not just doing the rote learning, the sort of factory industrial model of education. And I think when you look around the world, there are some real pioneer countries in this space. You look at the Finns or the Singaporeans. The risk for the UK, to be a bit parochial here, is that we are quite complacent about our education brand in the world. And let's face it, that the fact that we have such a kite mark for educational quality is a great advantage for many of us. It means I can go to Singapore and make a speech on education to proper educators, who've really done this stuff, and they'll listen a bit more closely because they think, well, the Brits know what they're talking about. What we found in the last 4 or 5 years is that the UK as a whole, and it's whatever side of Brexit you are, we've had more of a magnifying glass on us. The world's been watching us quite closely, and that AAA rating for competence in our businesses, the way we govern ourselves, the way we handle ourselves, and our education system is being challenged. People are coming up quite fast behind that, and they don't see us as sufficiently pioneering or innovative in this space. And that will have a real impact on education, our education system at all levels. We currently have this great advantage in this space, which is that we control much of the global accreditation of education. People want a sort of UK kite mark on their degree, on their qualification. Is that going to be the case in 20 years' time, or are others going to be overtaking us in that space? Because it's about to get very, very competitive.
One of the things I've always been curious about with this and on this topic has been about how far it's possible to teach sort of personality attributes. So I think you mentioned be kind, be curious, be brave are sort of kind of the things we should aspire to. And I think every parent wants that for their kids. My grandmother did once tell me never to stand up for anything because you'd only get hurt, but I think she was probably facetious. But do you think that's do you think that's teachable by a sort of mass education system? I mean, I think if I were to make one of the things that links, if you like, Eton, the rich schools in California, is actually they're not mass education systems. They can tailor. They're people in relatively secure lives. The kids are probably from less disrupted households and backgrounds than others. They can cope with a bit more softness, but also, can you teach it in a mass way?
I think you can. And actually, for much of history, we have been doing that, but we've tended to do it around the campfire rather than in a classroom setting. And one of the trends of the last couple of decades is we've subcontracted to schools so much of our children's education and stepped back from that. And it's a massive generalization, and there'll be lots of parents watching you saying, well, I do this every night with my kids. But a lot of the most interesting research going on at the moment, so I've done some of this work with the OECD, is in this space around how do you teach, and more interestingly and more challengingly, how do you actually assess it? Because ultimately, until we assess it, parents like me won't take it as seriously as we should, and will be part of the problem, because we're going to want our kids to survive against the tests that they're given. You watch any parent-teacher meeting when the head teacher stands up and says, okay, we're going to have extra classes to teach kindness, and we're going to drop, therefore, 2 maths GCSEs from the curriculum. That head teacher will not last long. But you can teach these things. And if I can just plug the book I've got coming out in January, 21st Century Survival Skills, is going to go through the way that we can teach and assess these things. So, for example, curiosity. There are exercises we can do where you take, for example, a BBC story. I'm going to say BBC rather than any of the more recent arrivals on the scene. Or maybe, okay, let's take a tortoise story. And where you encourage people to see the other perspective, where you get them to argue the other viewpoint. Effectively, a bit like Mandela at that Rugby World Cup final, you put on your opponent's shirt to demonstrate that empathy, that understanding of their position. There are ways to practice that, and then ways to teach, and then to assess it as well.
Can you tell me how? I'm sort of fascinated. How do you assess, say, kindness and curiosity and bravery? Like, how do you do it in a way? I mean, I think I agree with you that until you can assess it, a system run by bureaucrats cannot cope with it. It will just look like lost time if it's not being assessed. But how do you assess it?
So actually, a lot of the process on this is a bit like the way that you learn any other skills. You first of all, you observe them. So you look around and think, well, who is my role model? Who is someone who's really curious in life? And by the way, we're talking about these as skills we need to teach young people. But if you look around now, these are skills that we need right now to adapt to the changes around us. Look at the leadership that we've seen globally, or the lack of it, during the pandemic. We don't have leaders who can do empathy and strategy and critical thinking. You can probably count the global leaders who can do those things on the fingers of one hand, maybe. But you can step back and teach those things. So you can do some very specific exercises. And if you want to dig into this, I do encourage anyone to go and look at the global competencies work that the OECD have done in this space. You start with observing people, then you try and draw together the lessons that you've observed. You know, what are the teachable things, the features of people who are kind or curious or brave? Then you go out and practice it. So you think, in reality, if I was going to go and do something kind now in line with what I've just learned, what is that thing I can do? And then, most importantly, you get to the point where you teach it yourself. And we all know from our own lives that that's the point at which it really starts to sink in. You can do that with all of these, you know, what we call the new 21st century survival skills, but which are actually the older skills of them all. And just as, you know, when you're recruiting people in the workplace or to come to university, the assessments you do are actually looking at many of those things. You know, I'm desperately looking for the most curious kids out there to come to Oxford at the moment. And so we're assessing those things all the time. It's just we don't treat it with the seriousness that we treat the academic qualifications.
Okay. And do you think, I mean, I think there's a reasonable response to basically anyone who proposes new things to the curriculum is always to ask what comes out as well. So what do you think we could do less of?
I think we can spend much less time memorizing things that kids can look up. You know, Einstein said, why learn anything that you can read in an encyclopedia? And in a way now, it's why memorize anything that you can read on Wikipedia? We need people with the skills to go and retrieve knowledge and respond to it in a critical way, are able to see different perspectives, much more than the kids who can just recite that knowledge, that can learn it by rote. I think, you know, I think a lot of curricula are moving in this direction. You know, you look at the International Baccalaureate, I think that's already moving in this direction. So you're seeing people make those trade-offs as they go along. It has to be much more about how you learn rather than precisely what you learn. Okay.
I mean, I guess in some senses you're moving. I mean, I think long-standing educationists will feel like, oh, well, so we'll put you in a box as a sort of traditional Deweyist, right? You know, a progressive. People need to learn how to learn. We don't need to teach them as much if they are more self-possessed. Are there places you think have done well at doing that? Like I sort of think in a sense, the challenge with education is almost always, well, yeah, but you've got 25,000 schools to run. You've got to, you know, how's the machinery going to deliver this? Are there places you think we should look to on this stuff?
So I think there are quite kind of lonely pioneers all over the place. You know, there are Oxford professors trying to teach a global sense of history rather than just a very national focused curriculum. There are school teachers teaching creativity and really thinking hard about how you develop and assess these skills. There are pioneers in the international system who are thinking, how do we get a sense of peer pressure and competition into social emotional skills alongside the national competition around testing maths or science, for example. There are people in business who are developing new ways to train and assess the people they're recruiting, almost to compensate for what they haven't had in their education. What we need to do now is try and join the dots, if you like, so those different people can see they're part of a collective effort. You really need a whole society approach to education. Teachers have to be in the forefront of this, but you know, the pressures we face now, I mean, it's too important just to leave to teachers. So I hope we can have that sort of national conversation now around, you know, what is it most important to pass on to the next generation, and how can we all play a part in doing that?
And I mean, I guess there's a slight conflict, right, in a sense that, so just over your shoulder, Tom, we can see the heart of Hertford College.
Yeah.
I mean, you come from this sort of, you know, this elite institution, and in 10 years time, say 20 years time, when you've taken it over and you are the master of all the colleges and the vice chancellor, and you're able to fix admissions, I mean, do you feel like if the world followed your model, we'd end up with a radically different way that elite institutions work too? I mean, do you feel like there's something wrong with the fact that, you know, even your institution is still basically admitting kids with the highest A levels and not really looking a lot beyond that?
So in all of this, the thing I would really, really, really discourage is any sense this somehow has to be a top-down change. I mean, the change I'm articulating is actually bottom-up. And if you look at the constituencies that will often block it. I think universities will probably be one of the last to shift in this way because they're very bought into the current model, as you say. I think, by the way, governments are very unlikely to move in this direction. Many of them are also very bought into the current structure, particularly, you mentioned the UK and the US and others. So those will be two constituencies quite hard to shift in the right direction. Big tech is another that will spend more time retraining people rather than thinking, how do we deal with the causes of people learning the wrong things in the wrong way? And parents, as a parent, I can see that parents will often find it difficult to wrestle with these changes. So we definitely don't want it to be another top-down. The change will be driven by young people with the agency of the smartphone and that sense of hunger for knowledge and hunger for learning the skills they now can see they need in life. Now, where does that leave? It's a fair question. Where does that leave somewhere like Oxford and the heart on the wall and all the rest of it? Now, obviously, I have to point out at this stage that I came to this college myself as a state school kid. 81% of our students are now state school. Oxford is moving in the right direction. It has much, much further to go. I'd love to see us open up much more to less advantaged, economically advantaged international students, for example, and we're still not as diverse a community as we need to be. And there are lots of lessons for us from the lockdown, how we can move faster in that direction. But I do think institutions like this can play a role in experimenting, in being pioneering in this space, in recruiting young people on the basis of potential and not just on their qualifications. My college, by the way, we did that back in the 70s. The thing that transformed this college was that the tutors at the time said, we want to find the smartest kids in the country who aren't currently coming to Oxford because they don't get the A-levels they need. And so they went, at that stage, they went north. They went to northern state schools and said, send us your brightest kids.
Isn't this... I feel like the two big blocks in the UK, in my head on this are, first of all, the parents who basically fundamentally, someone once put it to me that the easiest way to sell something in education is to tell everyone how old it is and unreformed it is. Like, people want the ancient education, and everywhere around the world, whatever you've ever heard about, like Japan, Germany or Singapore, people want the academic education for their own kids. And that sense of the wanting the prestigious is one thing. But also, I think it's striking that you're talking about how someone has to experiment in universities to get off this treadmill. Harvard doesn't recruit just on top grades, right? Harvard gets kids on potential and leadership and all this stuff. If Harvard were a British university, we would think they're irredeemable hippies. We have this sort of cultural thing in the UK in particular about the kids with the top grade has to be the kid who gets in, as opposed to a kid with a broader skill set and leadership. The Rhodes Scholarship is probably the only scholarship in the UK which is actually not given to the academically best, but given to all-rounders who people can think make a broader contribution.
I think that's a fair point. And one thing it does show, of course, is that often financial muscle that does drive the change. I come back to that sliding doors point. The elites, the global elites, are moving in this direction already. And there's a real danger that the inequality that's been opened up by the lockdowns, the lack of access to education or quality education for most kids in the world, that divide gets larger. And so you do have this elite spinning off and basically doing kind of TED Talk type classes and learning to coach and learning to be leaders and to collaborate and teamwork, coming through all that with much, much more marketable skills than the rest of us who are slightly left behind, still working with the old model. And I fear that, that way, look at France, where it's the Northeast and the Southeast that are more likely to vote for National Front, vote for Marine Le Pen. Those are the areas that have been hardest hit by automation and migration. And those trends are only going to accelerate. And so the risk is, if we don't learn these new ways, maybe old ways of living together, then we're going to elect more Donald Trumps and Marine Le Pens. And that is perilous for all of us.
That's a very neat landing point for all of us. So thanks ever so much, Tom. We've hit the half hour. I should say that you're talking about a bottom-up process. Our partners at Big Change, who you're going to be hearing more from, who are sponsoring the next session, are running what they call their conversation on this on this topic, because they agree with you that you need to have a sort of bottom-up process. Our next session at 3:30, so now, is with Alia Ibria York, Stephen Tierney, and Alex Goat on these big questions. Have we lost sight of education's purpose? And invite everyone to join us for that. Later on, we have an event at 6:30 on the future of higher education, which is going to be looking to other models. Brilliant. We're going to run some slides now as we move on. Thank you ever so much to Tom. I thought that was fascinating.
Thanks, Chris.
And I'll see you all in a second. It's me again for the next one.